Hey guys, hope you're having a good day. I wanted to give you a quick wrap up of my August and September reads. I just got back from a week of surfing in the Canary Islands, and to distract myself from the fact that I'm now back in the very gloomy London weather, I thought I'd give you a little recap of my August and September reads. So, first of all, if you can see a pimple patch on my face, ignore it. The sunscreen was not agreeing with me. So first, for some stats, I read 12 books in the months of August and September. I read 3 ebooks, 4 physical books, and 5 books on audio. Some of them you may have seen me reading in my cozy autumnal reading vlog, so those I won't go too in-depth on, but all the others that I haven't talked about, I'll talk about a little more at length. Of the physical books I read, I've unhauled all of them except for one, and I actually will be unhauling this. I'm just giving it to a friend who is in Vietnam for 2 weeks, so I haven't had a chance to give it to him, but I'm seeing him later tonight, so that will also be out of my collection. I leave London for an extended period of time at the end of this month, so my goal for the last few weeks has been reading as many physical books as I can, which obviously has not been going well, and unhauling them. And then also not picking up any new books, which also has not been going super well. If you watched my London's Best Bookstore video, you'll see that I did end up picking up a few more books. Also, I ended up leaving one of the physical books I read at the hostel I work at in this little book cubby where people just leave books that they finish. But I also saw a book in there that I haven't read and I've been really wanting to, and everyone will probably be shocked that I haven't read it. And so I wanted to pick it up because it was free, and that's Babel by R.F. Kuang. So yeah, it hasn't been going too well. I think I've unhauled those 4 books, and then I just finished 2 physical books while I was at the surf camp. So I've unhauled 6 books in the last 2 months, and probably honestly also picked up 6 books. So yeah, not doing my best there. That I should work on. Of the 12 books I read, I rated 10 of them. There were 2 that I didn't rate, and I'll talk about them briefly. But of the 10 books I rated, I had a 3.5 average rating. Not bad, not amazing. I feel like I had a lot of very meh books, but also a handful of really, really amazing books these past 2 months. My lowest rated was a 2-star, my highest rated was a 5-star. So no 1-stars yet. I don't know if I've given out any 1-stars this entire year. I feel like I probably maybe have. Oh, I rated one of the Academy part of the Ghost Bird series 1-star because it was just so ridiculously bad. I've only had one 1-star book of the entire year, so that's not bad. One of the books that I read this month, actually, I just finished it yesterday while traveling back from the Canary Islands. That was I was debating between a 1 and 2-star. I will tell you about that next month, but none these past 2 months. There was one book I read in August that completely wrecked me. I was sobbing, and that inspired me to tell you about these books in order of least to most emotional. Starting with the 2 books I didn't rate, I listened to them both on audio, and that was Quidditch Through the Ages and From the Wizarding Archive, both with writing from J.K. Rowling. I've mentioned in some of my other videos that when I'm having a hard time mentally, I turn back to childhood favorites. I didn't rate them because I don't want to be supporting J.K. Rowling by rating those books. Moving on from those, the first official book I will talk about was The Secret Life of a Cemetery by Benoît Gallot. So this is one of the books that I read when I went to the forest for the weekend and did a cozy little autumn vlog. I ended up giving it 2 stars and honestly didn't feel much at all. I don't even feel like I learned a lot, which is a bummer because one of my goals when I read nonfiction is to learn. And this is just a book about Père Lachaise, which is one of the most famous cemeteries in the world. It's in Paris, and it's written by the current curator. He mostly talks about the reemergence of nature in the cemetery since COVID and since pesticides were banned, which was interesting, but honestly, I didn't feel like it needed to be a whole book. I wanted more about the lore of the cemetery, and I felt like I was missing a lot of that. That was The Secret Life of a Cemetery, and I gave that 2 stars. The next book I also finished in that vlog. So the second one is How to Survive a Horror Story by Mallory Arnold. This one I gave 3 stars, honestly probably more like a 2.5. It was a quick thriller, but nothing groundbreaking. I didn't think it was very unique, but I had an okay time reading it. So How to Survive a Horror Story is about 7 authors who get invited to this house of the now deceased author, Mortimer Queen. He was a really famous horror author, and he invited these 7 other horror authors to come to his house to receive something from his will. They all have a connection to him, and initially we don't know what their connection to him is, but throughout the story that gets revealed. When they arrive at this house, they're told that what they're left in his will is a game. They basically have to survive the house. So they go room to room, trying to figure out clues, and as they do that, the audience and also the participants are getting to know how each author knew Mortimer Queen. Our main character is the only non-famous author of the group. She's more of a struggling writer and hasn't been able to get any of her books published yet. And she had this one encounter with the author that she doesn't remember at all. So not only are you figuring out how the other authors knew Mortimer Queen, but you're also figuring out how the main character knew him, and she's figuring that out as well. Things that I liked about it were the presence of the house. I like when an inanimate object is kind of made a character. So this house definitely has its own personality. It's talked about as being hungry, and that's something I really enjoy. And I also liked the kind of not knowing what side of the story is real. So you're not sure if your narrator is reliable, and you also have these flashbacks to the past from the perspective of our other authors, but again, you don't know if those are reliable. So I enjoyed those, but especially towards the end of the book, it all felt very predictable, a little bit cliche, and nothing was that thrilling or shocking, quite honestly. The next book on my list is Tress of the Emerald Sea by Brandon Sanderson. This is the first Brandon Sanderson book I ever read. I've been told that it's not a bad place to start, especially if you're not familiar or super comfortable with high fantasy. So I thought that this would be a fun introduction to the author. As you can probably guess from it being pretty low on my list, it was a little bit disappointing. I didn't feel a lot about the book, and I gave it 3 stars. This book is about our main character Tress, and she lives on this island that they call the Rock, that people rarely ever leave. She has a pretty simple life, and she's happy with it. She is a window washer, and her best friend, and kind of only friend Charlie, is, I forget whether he's the Duke's son or the King's son. He's either a prince or like the next Duke of this island, and he hides that identity from her, but she knows, and he kind of knows that she knows. His father obviously is not a fan of him hanging out with this random low-class girl all the time, and takes him away from the island across the seas to seek a bride. It's established very early on that Tress and Charlie had more than a friendship. They have romantic feelings for each other, and they both kind of hoped to marry each other eventually. So when Charlie is taken away from this island by his father, Tress is heartbroken, and when it turns out that disaster has struck and Charlie has gone missing, Tress decides to leave the island and go on this quest to save him. So it feels like a very traditional adventure story geared towards a younger audience. Tress goes off on the adventure and meets all of these people who kind of tag along. It's found family, it has a talking rat, and she has to get through all these seas that become progressively deadlier. Something I really liked about this was the magic system. The seas aren't made of water, they're made of these spores that when they come in contact with water, different properties are released. Each sea is a different color, depending on the color of the spores, and each spore is more or less deadly. And of course, she eventually has to go through the most deadly spore sea to find Charlie. I had a good time reading it. I was invested enough to be interested about how the story would wrap up, and I did enjoy Tress's character development, but it didn't feel like there were much stakes in the story because you kind of knew it was going to end up all right. It's a fairy tale. You know that things are going to work out okay, and that the people that you care about are going to be okay. So because of that, I didn't feel much for most of the characters. I wasn't scared for them. I wasn't that excited for them. So overall, I'm glad I read it, especially because of how much hype it has. It was nice that I understood the magic system, but it did feel like this was a very entry-level, more like young adult style book, which makes sense because I believe he wrote it for his daughter. That was Tress of the Emerald Sea by Brandon Sanderson. The next book I read was kind of a booktube darling a few years ago. It's been on my radar of things that I'm interested in reading, but I've never really run out of my way to pick it up, so when I saw it at a used bookstore, that was kind of the ideal situation for me. And that is Ace of Spades by Faridah Àbíké-Íyímídé. And again, I gave this book 3 stars. I gave a lot of 3 stars this month, unfortunately. But all of these 3-star books I read, I'm not upset I read. They're not bad books, they just didn't work for me the way that a higher rated book would. So I think the thing that got so many people excited about this book is it's pitched as Gossip Girl meets Get Out. It follows the only 2 Black students at a very prestigious private high school. One of them, Chiamaka, is the most popular girl in school. She's the head prefect. Everybody either wants her or wants to be her, but she has curated her life to be that way. Everything that she's done is very calculated to achieve that position. The other main character is Devon, and they are kind of opposites. He is a nobody at the school. He's on a scholarship, and his mom can barely afford to send him to that school, even with the scholarship. What brings them together is that an anonymous person named Aces starts texting everyone at school, kind of spilling their secrets. They both have things in their past or in their present that they don't want to be made public, and Aces starts sending videos, photos, evidence of their secrets to the entire student body. Not only that, but it seems like Aces is also setting them up to fail. And Chiamaka and Devon have to team up to find out who this is and take them down. I liked that these characters, especially Chiamaka, were unlikable. She knows that she's done bad things, but she honestly doesn't really care because she has goals that she wants to achieve. And she knows that being one of the only 2 Black students at the school means that she has to work harder than everyone else. I preferred Chiamaka's point of view to Devon's, and although both of them are the main characters, it does feel like Devon gets more of a spotlight. I don't know how it breaks down in terms of page count of perspectives, who gets more, but it does feel like Chiamaka is set up more as a villainous character than Devon. He seems to be a very pure character who sometimes does bad things, but it's out of necessity, while Chiamaka, I think, is set up to be a little bit more of a morally gray, self-serving character. And part of that makes sense because of their enormous wealth difference, because there's not only race issues going on in this book, it goes a lot into class issues as well, which I appreciated. So I appreciated the commentary, but I wanted more from Chiamaka's point of view. I also liked some of the queer rep in this book, but for one character, the queer rep comes very out of the blue, and I'm trying to do this without spoiling, but it felt very glossed over. I wish it had been more fleshed out, almost, and that storyline wraps up in a really unsatisfying way, because one of the relationships we get is so much more in depth, and you know so much more about both of the characters and their feelings for each other, and therefore you care more about that relationship than the other final relationship in the book. That probably sounds all very confusing, but I'm trying really hard not to spoil anything. The ending felt like it wrapped up very, very quickly for how much buildup there was, and there were a lot of emotional and interpersonal issues that I feel like weren't really resolved and were just glossed over, and then we were just expected to be okay with it. So there were definitely parts that I felt for in this book. And emotion is anger, and you feel that, especially when certain characters are framed and you know that they didn't do that thing, but the entire school and community wants to see the worst in them. But overall, I didn't care that much for the characters. It was all very melodramatic, which it is a young adult book about like high schoolers, and a comp for it is Gossip Girl, which is so melodramatic, but it's just not my personal taste. That was Ace of Spades by Faridah Àbíké-Íyímídé, and I gave that 3 stars. On to my next 3-star book. I read Strange Houses by Uketsu. So you've probably seen this doing the rounds on BookTube. This is a Japanese mystery that relies heavily on pictures. So basically this journalist gets their hands on a floor plan for a house that seemed to have some inconsistencies, and then asks an architect friend to then help them unravel what that could mean. And throughout the story, they find more floor plans and see how it's all connected. I thought it was really interesting. It was a book that I was very intrigued by the whole time, and I read it really, really quickly because it's pretty short and you're really helped along with the mystery. So the book really spells everything out for you. It will show you a floor plan and then explain what you didn't see in that floor plan, what that inconsistency could be caused by, and then what that means overall. I found it very creative. I really liked the format of it and the mixed media element, and I would recommend reading it, but don't expect this to be a really gripping mystery thriller. I didn't find it that creepy. Obviously, there's darkness as the mystery unravels, but because your hand is held throughout the entire thing, I didn't feel any suspense. It's not the sort of mystery that you can guess what's gonna happen at the end, because there's not a lot of logic to it, if that makes sense. The characters just come up with kind of a ridiculous or far-fetched theory, and every time they come up with a theory, they just assume it's right, and there's nothing to refute it, but there's also nothing really to prove it. So I was shocked that they actually solved the mystery, because I was like, where did you come up with these random ideas? I don't know that I ever would have, but good for them, I guess, for doing that. It was another book that I had fun with, but there wasn't a ton of emotion behind it. It wasn't like super thrilling or suspenseful, and it's not something that I've thought about that much since. The next book is our final 3-star of the last 2 months, and that's 50 Words for Snow by Nancy Campbell. This is another nonfiction book, and much like the title suggests, it's just the author going into the etymology of 50 words for snow in 50 different languages. Something to know about me is I'm a big old nerd when it comes to words. I love languages, I love words, and so I loved learning about the different etymology and how the landscape and culture of a place affects their language. I wish the author had stuck more to that sort of thing in the etymology and science and how specific words came to be, but sometimes she focused on her own personal connection to a certain type of snow, and I found that less interesting. There was one word specifically where it was just a long story about her own experience in a certain type of snow, and I didn't really learn much about why that word is used and the significance of it in that language and culture and country. So that was kind of a bummer. And I also wish that the same amount of time and energy had been put into each entry. There are some that are 4 or 5 pages long, and you can tell the author thought was really interesting and really cared about. And then there were others, like the word for first snow in Korean is literally like 4 lines. And it has a really interesting meaning. It says, the word for snow in Korean, nun, is the same word as is used for eye. And so if you experience the first snowfall of the year, chiot-nun, which is the word for snow, with someone you have eyes for, it is said that true love will drift into your arms. And I think that's so beautiful, and it tells so much about the culture that this word comes from, but she doesn't go into it beyond that at all. And I wish that she had gone more into it. But yeah, overall, I really enjoyed this book. I enjoyed learning about how environment shapes language. And it was interesting seeing from a country that maybe gets snow once or twice a year, or it's very, very rare, compared to a country which is under snow 50% of the year, the different words and different vocabulary needed to survive and exist in that context. So that was 50 Words for Snow by Nancy Campbell, and that was like a 3, maybe 3.5 star. So now we are getting to the books that made me more emotional. So next is Blue Iris, Poems and Essays by Mary Oliver. Mary Oliver is one of my favorite poets, if not my favorite poet, and I love finding new collections of hers that I've never heard of. This is a book that I bought when I was in Paris, and I read it physically, and I really enjoyed it. I gave it 4 stars, but it's not an all-time favorite, and I did end up decluttering it, just because I'm pretty picky about that. I think if I was living someplace that was more permanent right now, it's a book that I would have kept. Same with 50 Words for Snow. In the context that I'm in right now, it's just a little bit more difficult to do that. So, Blue Iris. This was 10 poems and 2 essays by Mary Oliver about nature, as most of her work is, but specifically focused on flowers, trees, other plants, basically all sorts of flora. And as always, her work is just so evocative and beautiful and makes me want to escape to nature and just live in a little hut in the woods. So there were some poems that I connected to less. There were some that I connected to more, obviously. Specifically, her essay on a camping trip she did with one of her friends was one of my favorites in the entire collection, and it hits even harder when you're in nature reading. So there was parts where I was traveling on trains and stuff and reading a poem or 2 at a time, and that didn't hit quite as hard as when I was sitting on a rock in the sun on the beach reading these beautiful words that Mary Oliver wrote. I feel like I can't put this higher because it was a very specific, singular type of emotion that she made me feel. So the ones higher on the list made me feel, I'd say, a wider variety of emotions. But Blue Iris by Mary Oliver is still a book that I highly recommend, and maybe one day I'll get another copy, because also it's a really beautiful color and the texture of it is really nice. So I would like to have it in my collection at some point. On to the top 3 books that made me feel the most emotion that I read in the last 2 months. Number 3 is The Story of a Lost Child by Elena Ferrante, and it's the 4th and final installment of the Neapolitan series. I gave this book 5 stars. It was a really beautiful conclusion to the arc of Elena and Liliv's lives and how they've come together and moved apart throughout the years. It's obviously the last in a 4-book series, so I'm not going to go into what actually happens, but it really focuses more on motherhood and independence and holding that independence even as a mother, and how the role of being a woman shifts throughout the lives of these two Italian women. The way that Elena Ferrante evokes compassion for these two people who have made very different choices, and often choices that I don't agree with, is really astonishing. Her writing just pulls the emotion out of you, and especially after 4 books of caring for these people, not only Lila and Elena, but all the side characters, except for Nino. Fuck Nino. But I cared about all the rest, including the ones that aren't good people. And you also care about the place. You care about their neighborhood and the people who stayed behind, and how it continues to entangle everyone who grew up there, regardless of if they tried to leave or not. There's a lot of sadness in these books and a lot of heaviness, and it feels very true to life. Elena Ferrante was writing about a very fraught time in Italian history, and although there is an air of beauty and wistfulness, it's not glamorized. And I think that's really important and really beautiful. So that was The Story of a Lost Child by Elena Ferrante. Next is The Return by Rachel Harrison, and I gave this 4 stars. I rated it lower than The Story of a Lost Child, but I felt a wider range of emotions in this one, and so that's why I'm putting it higher on the list. I just realized that somehow So Thirsty was not recorded in my reading of the last 2 months. Please hold. Okay, I'll finish talking about The Return and then go back to So Thirsty before my final reveal of my most emotional book. Really good, very professional. Okay, what was I saying about The Return? This is a story about a group of 4 friends, and at the beginning of the story, one of the girls goes missing. It picks up again 2 years later when Jules, the girl who went missing, suddenly returns with no memory of where she's been for the last 2 years or of what happened, and she wants to have a little reunion trip. So these 4 girls go to a big fancy hotel in upstate New York and slowly start to realize that the Jules who came back is not the same person who left, and maybe is not even human. I gave this book 4 stars. It was exciting, it was haunted, I was intrigued. I didn't know what was coming next, and there was the sense of doom building the entire time. And I want that tension to be building during my horror thriller books. And this definitely delivered on that. I really enjoyed the dynamics of the friend group. The 4 women all have different relationships to each other, and it felt very realistic in terms of how people fall into different roles within a friend group and how those dynamics change when one of those people aren't there. It really talks about how the dynamic has shifted since Julie being gone, and then when Julie comes back, tries to reabsorb her and readjust to her reappearance, and it never fully gets back to the way that the 4 were before. Rachel Harrison's horror is a little campy and a little over the top. It's not disgusting, can't sleep at night horror. It's almost cozy in a way, because I feel like you do expect that the people that you're supposed to care about have an overall good outcome at the end. And so it's a horror that is exciting and intriguing without being anxiety-inducing, which I really appreciate as an anxious girl. This book had me empathizing with especially the main character. She is a little lost in life. She feels like all of her friends are ahead of her. She obviously misses her best friend and desperately wants the person who came back to be the same person who left, and is really struggling to deal with the fact that maybe Julie isn't the same person. One thing that drives me crazy in horror, thriller, or mystery books is when the main character doesn't confide in the people they're close to about the crazy things happening around them. And so the fact that Elise, the main character, almost immediately tells one of her friends and is like, yo, this place is fucking creepy, do you agree? And the other friends are like, yeah, this place is creepy. It was another thing that just lessened the anxiety, but kept the tension going, because there's still this thing going on and you don't know what it is, and the characters don't know what it is, but they at least have each other, so they know that someone else is aware of what's happening. And I need that in these types of books. As you can probably tell by my enthusiasm about this book, I really, really enjoyed it. I gave it 4 stars, maybe more like a 4.25, honestly, and I just really enjoyed the character development, the plot development, and the overall conclusion of the book. I think it ended exactly how it needed to end, and the final chapter gave just the right amount of closure. There was even like a little bit of a romantic subplot that I was invested in, and I loved the bond that the three women had. So that's a lot of feelings that I had for this book, and that is why it's number 2 on the list. Speaking of Rachel Harrison, I also read So Thirsty by Rachel Harrison after finishing The Return, because it really made me crave more of her books, especially as the weather gets a little more autumnal, and I want to read for the season and for the vibes, but I'm a little baby and real scary stuff is too much for me. I would rank So Thirsty. First of all, I gave it 3 stars, and I'd rank it in terms of how emotional it made me in between Ace of Spades and Strange Pictures. This is another book that I went more in depth on in my cozy weekend reading blog, so I'm not going to go too in depth, but I gave it 3 stars, and it is about 2 friends who go on a birthday weekend up in the snow and end up at a vampiric party, and then things continue from there. There were parts that I felt apprehension and a little tension, and I did want the best for these characters, but I didn't feel as emotionally attached to these 2 characters as I did to the 4 women in The Return. And the side characters also didn't speak to me as much as all of the side characters in The Return. So that's why I would rank it much lower than The Return. I still had a good time, and I'm glad I read it, but it didn't make me nearly as emotional. Now we're back on track, and to our final book of the wrap-up, the book that made me so emotional it made me sob in front of 9 teenagers that I was touring around Scotland and Ireland. So that was only slightly embarrassing. I shouldn't be surprised because literally every Fredrik Backman book makes me cry. I don't know how he does it, but he does. And I always think that I've made it. I'll get to the end and be like, oh, it's a happy story, so I'm not gonna cry, or I made it through the most emotional part, so I'm not gonna cry. And then I close the book. It's always after I finish. I close the book and just the tears start coming. So that's what happened with this one. It's My Friends by Fredrik Backman, and I gave it 5 stars. The story is about Louisa, who has just turned 18 and graduated out of the foster system. She's been in the foster system almost her whole life. It obviously has been a really hard time for her. And one thing that really helped her throughout those really hard years was a painting of 3 friends on the end of a pier. It is a world-famous painting, and at the beginning of the book, she sneaks into a gallery where the painting is being auctioned off, and after a series of events, ends up the owner of this painting. The rest of the story is basically her and some people she meets along the way traveling back to the birthplace of this painting. And the story oscillates between the present day and then a character telling stories of the past, of before this painting existed. And she learns about who these 3 people are on the pier, and through that process also works through a lot of grief over a friend who has recently died and anger over her life circumstances. I adore the way Fredrik Backman explores love in his books because he has such an expansive view of what that means. He talks about the love between friends, the love within families, romantic love, platonic love, unrequited love, painful love, the love of an idea, nostalgic love, and every line he writes about it just squeezes your heart a little bit. This book focuses on belonging and the importance of the relationships you choose over the relationships that you are born into. Backman always has a sense of loneliness in his book. That's always a subject he tackles. And without fail, he makes you feel seen in your own personal loneliness. The synopses of his books never encompass the emotional heart of them because his books aren't as much about plot as they are about the characters and the way you grow to care for them. And that's what is so emotional about his books, is that once you care so much about characters, even tiny things that happen to them are so heart-wrenching. There's a reveal in one of the first few chapters that isn't said in the synopsis, so I don't want to spoil that because I was surprised by it, and I thought it was very clever. So I don't want to go too much into what happens, but I highly recommend this book. I recommend all of Fredrik Backman's books that I've read, and just have tissues and a pen ready, because that's another thing about his books is they are endlessly annotatable. I always want to highlight basically everything I read in his books. yeah, so that was My Friends by Fredrik Backman, and that was 5 stars. And that was also the final book of this reading wrap-up. So if you've read any of these books and you have similar or very different opinions to me, I would love to know. I hope your reading year is going really well, and I'll see you next time.